And the fact is, the spirit world is the real world in which we really exist. The real body, the real self, is the spirit. All real things are spirits. Spirit being the fundamental stuff configured in a certain form, emanating out of the ground of creation, the unified field. It emanates from there and dissipates back into it upon its death. And all the time it keeps changing and evolving. In other words, the spirit, which is the fundamental stuff that emanates from the ground of creation, taking on a certain form of that entity with a particular set of functions that are based on the purpose for which that entity exists. And that is the spirit world. We don't experience that world. We don't experience the real body. And we don't experience the real spirit, which is the real body, the real self. What we experience is the virtual reality body, the virtual reality self, in the realm of the mind dimension. The world we experience, which is not a world even. It is virtual reality stuff, experienced as it manifests in the mind dimension. Whatever you experience is the manifestation in the mind dimension. I don't experience what you experience, right? What I experience is not what you experience. But they always thought, the general public, mostly, when they experience a particular perspective, and I experience a different perspective, they thought these are different perspectives of the same real world. Like you are there, therefore your perspective of the world is from that direction, you're looking here, and I am in this spot, and I look towards you, so my perspective of this. Both being of the real world. That's where they were wrong. We don't experience the real world. The real world in which the real you exist and real me exist, and wherever here there is, the real world in which we both exist. But we don't experience that. You experience what the perspective manifestation of a virtual reality world manifested in the mind dimension, which emanates from your brain. And from my brain emanates a virtual reality world with this perspective manifested in the mind dimension, which I experience. So we experience two different virtual reality worlds, unique to each of us. Okay. So there are three things actually, the real world and two virtual reality worlds.
So how does one unite or unify or get back to the real or realize the real?
Well, let me just go back to finishing up on the spiritual aspect of things. The spirituality, therefore, is to come to the realization of the real world, the world of the spirit. You can call it the real dimension, you can call it the spirit dimension. So there is the real dimension and the mind dimension. The mind dimension is the virtual reality stuff you are experiencing. So to be spiritual, or to be seeking the spiritual aspects of your being, to want to be spiritual, to be interested in spirituality, means that you must be interested in the real world, to realize the real world, that there is a real world that you do not experience. And there is a real relationship you have with real entities in the real world, which you do not experience in the mind dimension as you experience a superficial relationship between superficial virtual reality entities in your mind in the mind dimension, in the television being displayed there.
I grasp what you're saying about what we are experiencing is the mind dimension versus the real dimension. One who seeks a realization of the real world,
Of the spirit.
of the spirit, that is certainly the ultimate, that realization of the spirit versus simply the mind in the mind dimension.
Well, yes, but let us understand this very clearly. You have to first experience what it is. You have to first realize and completely become familiar with what it is you experience as your mind. Without knowing, without realizing, without becoming fully familiar with the mind dimension, without becoming fully familiar with your mind, the virtual reality world that you experience, in and of itself, for what it is, how can you transcend that into the real? Because you will always have this as the veil between the real and the consciousness that this is.
What role does the ego play here?
Well, the ego is an aspect of the mind in the mind dimension. And the ego is not a real entity. The
Thank
ego
God.
is just, yes, thank God. But it is an important, just as important as your visual images or the sounds you hear is. Ego is another aspect of the mind based on the brain-mind system's design to manifest this idea of a self, which is the perceived self.
Perceived self.
Perceived self, of the virtual reality self that you experience.
So that is what you term, the term you use to
Perceived self.
describe what we experience, what
you experience as self.
as self.
Yes, which is not really the self.
It's a perceived
It's
self.
a perceived self. It's a virtual reality perceived self that is manifested
with an ego.
With an ego, with the characteristics
With the
of a
senses.
self. Of a self. Of I. Of me.
Ah, there it is.
You see?
That,
Right?
and that's how we know it's perceived.
Yes, that's how we know it's perceived, because we separate ourselves from other things. The real world is where your real body is, but your brain-mind system doesn't experience that. What you experience is a perceived self. That is but a manifestation in the mind dimension, construed by your brain-mind system based on its design. It is designed to separate itself as an entity from other entities in the real world. The real world is but one. It's one continuum.